metropolitan in Baltimore City. Approximately a third of it is what we call prime housing, meaning it's up to code, it's habitable, people can live there, and it's physically adequate. The rental market in prime housing is the tenants pay the rent, the landlords make profit off of that, but they also put money back into the building so that the building can maintain as a rental property. Then another third of the housing is kind of borderline. It has code violations, it is being inhabited, but might be legally uninhabitable because of certain conditions. But people are indeed living in those. The business model for being a landlord in borderline properties is you're extracting more money from it than you're putting back into it. So it's still a very profitable business. In fact, as I described this, the highest level of housing is the least profitable for landlords. The most profitable housing is subprime slum property, okay? And it's just the ratio between what you're taking out of the property and rent compared to what you're putting back into the property. This isn't a business school, but I could give a whole lecture on business models for how to make money off of other people's housing. But, then about a third of the property in Baltimore is subprime. And what I mean by that, it is definitely below code, legally uninhabitable. It has significant conditions such as holes in the roof, bad rodent and mice infestation, mold, lead paint, things that people should not be living in, but nonetheless are. The problem with this housing is it may not be economical to put money back into it. And at this point, the owner is extracting as much wealth as they can from the building, and the building will go down. It will become uninhabitable and vacant at some point. So you can see there's at the top of the market, it's a good, thriving market. At the bottom of the market, anybody living in that housing is on their way out of that housing. And in the middle, it's just a struggle to see. Yeah, question?
What proportion of city housing is abandoned?
The numbers on that range tremendously, from maybe 15,000 to 45,000 units. Now, one thing to remember about Baltimore City is that back in the heyday, we had a population of about 1.2 million. We only have half of that now. So Baltimore is like Detroit, my hometown, in that it used to be a much larger city, and the population has contracted. That's partly because of, largely because of the loss of the industrial base and the jobs, but then also the result of redlining and white flight and moving out of the city. So the combination of those things over time have, reduced the population. We've still got all this housing, but not nearly enough people to actually fill all that housing. So you're going to see a fair amount of abandoned housing, and there's a whole question about what to do about that. I should also say I described the third. There's another group of housing which you're getting at that is kind of off the map entirely, which is to say it is vacant, except it may not be. There may be people indeed living in vacant housing. Yeah.
Do you know how that compares to other cities in Philadelphia?
I think, I don't have a lot of data on that, but yeah, we're Baltimore is fairly compatible with, or comparable to other big cities that suffered a decline after World War II, and as the industrial base dropped and as people moved out. Now we've got the reverse trend right now, though, that more people are moving into the city than are moving out there, which has also some interesting things. Let me talk about, sorry, question? Yeah.
Do you know the proportion of, you talk about the people who manage these buildings?
Yeah.
Does it differ in terms of time where the skew of like management companies versus like individual people in
There's a range, and I wouldn't say that any one business type is going to be better or worse in that sense. Baltimore is a little different than many large cities, for instance New York, in that our housing model are townhouses, row houses, and individual units within a group, as opposed to big apartment buildings with multiple levels. Because of that, and because of prior ownership, it was more moms and pops and families that owned them. And so there are, I'm gonna say, a proportionately greater number of small landlords in Baltimore City. And that's partly because of the way the housing is structured. And small landlords, I will give them some sympathy. It's tough. You know, you've got a property that is not particularly valuable. You can get the rent, hopefully, although depending on who you're renting to, that may be a challenge too. But small landlords are often undercapitalized. They don't have the money to put back into the building, and that's where sometimes the property will slip from kind of being in the middle to going downhill. Okay. So that's housing quality in Baltimore. Let's talk about housing affordability for a minute. Y'all know Baltimore is a fairly poor city, but let me give you a few stats here. Again, looking at the infographic renting in Baltimore City, we have about 250,000 families in Baltimore City. About half of them own their own houses, and about half of them are renters. That's a higher percentage of renters, by the way, than in many other, not so much urban areas, but other parts of the country in particular. We have a pretty high tenant base. But then if you take all of the tenants and break them down between who can afford their rent and who cannot afford their rent, and I'm using here the federal definition of rent affordability, which is you shouldn't be paying more than 30% of your income for rent and utilities. So using that standard, about 43% of tenants in Baltimore City can afford their rent, and 57% cannot afford their rent. You know, that's just, obviously there are extremes here, but that's just the averages. For people who can't afford their rent, they basically have two choices. One is that they're either going to rent housing that they cannot afford, but to try to get safe and healthy housing, or they rent housing that they can afford, but that's going to be in the subprime market most of the time, and they're not going to be in safe and healthy housing. So they're kind of trading off between, am I more likely to get evicted for non-payment of rent because I can't afford the rent, or am I more likely to get lead poisoning or mold or have my child bitten by a rat if I live somewhere where I can afford? So that's the tough choice that people who are living in poverty have to make as they get their housing. I should also say that these numbers are a few years old, but the fair market value of a two-bedroom apartment in Baltimore City, a family, for a family, is about almost $1,400 a month. But if you take the average tenant's income, which is about $30,000, 30% of that means that they can really only afford to pay about $750 for an apartment, but the fair market value is almost twice that. So you see the predicament that people are in between the supply of affordable housing, which is low, and the supply of unaffordable housing, which is high. It's not hard to get an apartment, even if you don't have a credit rating, even if you've been evicted. You can find another place to live most of the time, but the quality of that housing is going to be lower and lower and lower the more issues you've had in the past. So, the result, and this is, I'm sure you've seen this before, Baltimore City is a city of poor tenants who live in poor housing conditions. Now, I should say, and this is where the Public Justice Center comes in, we're lawyers. We're public interest lawyers. We represent tenants. We represent about 700 some tenants a year in individual cases, and we also bring a number of class actions, and we do a lot of legislative lobbying on tenants' rights issues. So we're familiar with it both from being in court on individual cases to the legislators who are making the laws. The poor housing conditions and the poor tenants come together in the District Court of Maryland for Baltimore City, more affectionately known as Rent Court. And Rent Court is where you go to get evicted, basically. It's the intersection of kind of the social issues and then the legal machinery that is set up to collect the rent for the landlord And if that is not accomplished, to move the tenant from being housed to homeless. I'm going to say if you read the law, the purpose of rent court is to balance both the tenant's rights and responsibilities and the landlord's rights and responsibilities. It's a contract. It goes both ways. The tenant's obligated to pay the rent, the landlord's obligated to provide safe and habitable housing. If one of them doesn't comply with their part of the contract, there are legal remedies for that. The difficulty with rent court, the way it is actually practiced, is not the law on the books so much as it is how it is actually practiced in rent court. I will show you that rent court is very efficient at collecting money for the landlord and failing that at moving tenants out of the housing. It is very ineffective at maintaining or enforcing landlord responsibilities to keep up the property. And I'll show you a few things about that. We did this study in 2015, that's the two-sided sheet here, called Justice Learned, how renters are processed in Baltimore City Rent Court. And we did this by surveying tenants who were in rent court, looking at records, putting together a lot of data to show what is really happening in rent court. In spite of the way the law is written, what happens? The reality is this, is there's about 150,000 eviction cases filed in Baltimore City every year. Now, remember I said that there were 250,000 families in Baltimore and half of them are renters? That's about 125,000 rental families and 150,000 eviction complaints. It means the average tenant is sued for eviction 1.2 times per year. Okay, now that's the average. It means there are many that are never sued, but it means there are also many who are being sued month after month or every other month. They're in a recurrent situation where they get the money together for this month, but then that puts them behind on some other bill, so they pay that off, and so the next month they're behind on the rent again, and they're going through this cycle. And every time they go through the eviction process, as well as having to pay the rent, they have to pay the court costs and the late charges. And so the rent costs start building up, and it becomes harder and harder to get out of that cycle. And at some point, they start spiraling down. They get evicted from that housing, and then usually have to move to a lower level of housing. A lower level of housing that won't check your credit rating, for instance, but will charge you more money and provide you less services. So that's kind of what people are fighting with. It also means, though, that in rent court, the judges are just overwhelmed with the number of cases. There are as many as 1,000 cases a day heard in Baltimore City Rent Court. Now, most of those cases default, meaning the tenant doesn't show up and automatically loses. And the judge is judging those cases by, like, all of these cases, anybody here? Okay, all evicted. You know, it's very efficient. For the tenants who do show up, there's a couple of big things that are differences. One is tenants are represented by counsel about 5% of the time. Landlords are represented by counsel or by agents about 95% of the time. So there's a huge disparity in terms of their knowledge and ability to use the law in their own favor. Like I said, the law itself is not that bad. If they knew and could enforce the law, they would be in better shape. One thing that our study found is that about 60% of tenants who appeared at rent court had a good legal defense for not paying the rent. And the legal defense was usually the landlord didn't keep the property up. So, I mean, here's the example of the way legally it should work, is if, let's say the rent is $100, the tenant doesn't pay the $100, and the tenant says to the judge, hey judge, there's a hole in my roof, I've got mold, I've got rats. And then the judge would determine, well, what is the actual value of that apartment? If it was all fixed up, it'd be $100. But with those conditions, maybe the property is worth only $50 a month. Maybe it's only worth $25 a month. And then what does the tenant really owe? That's what the rent court should be doing. And if you have a lawyer, that is what we will be doing. We will be showing the judge not only the landlord side of the story, that the tenant didn't pay the rent, but we'll explain why the tenant didn't pay the rent, and the judge should determine what's the proper rent that is really due. And in that case, tenants often avoid eviction. When we get to solutions, I'll talk about the lawyer component of this a little bit more. The other thing I mentioned, though, is that the court does a very poor job of enforcing the law against landlords. One thing we found out, and this is on the two little red boxes, there are houses at the bottom of this sheet. In order to use the landlord-tenant courts in Maryland, landlords are required to be in compliance with licensing and lead paint laws. But when we examined the landlords appearing in court and winning evictions, 79% of them were not in compliance with the lead paint law. 79% non-compliance. That means it's the rare landlord who is in compliance. 68% of them are not in compliance with the registration and licensing provisions. Now, this is, again, a legal defense to an eviction, but the tenants don't know this, the landlords don't say it, and the court doesn't ask. Because remember, the court has to process 1,000 evictions a day. Even if the tenant shows up, the average trial is 1 minute. It's the landlord says, so did you pay the judge says, did you pay the rent? And if the tenant says anything other than no, if he says, yeah, but, eviction will be granted. The judge doesn't inquire into any of the reasons for it. So this is a very high process, mass process court that results in a lot of evictions. I mentioned that 60% of tenants had a good legal defense when they showed up. Only 8% of them were actually able to present their defense to the judge. And that's why we say tenants get processed at rent. They're just shoved through. It takes a very savvy and articulate tenant to stand up and say, no, I didn't pay the rent, and here's why, and make a case. Obviously, having a lawyer helps that. Okay, so that's what rent court is. Let me stop here for a minute with the issues, and then I'm going to switch to solutions. But before I get to solutions, any questions about this? Anything? Yes, ma'am?
This might not be this might be a silly question, but is the reason that the tenants don't have like legal defense a lot of the time because they can afford it, or?
Yeah, basically, yeah, and I will say this is an issue in America that is beyond poor people. Even middle-class people can't afford lawyers much of the time. So, but certainly if you're poor, the only way you're going to be able to get a lawyer is to get essentially a legal aid lawyer, a public interest lawyer. Now there are a number of groups, the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau, Maryland Legal Aid, that's the biggest organization that provides representation to tenants. The Public Justice Center is probably next. We have a homeless persons representation project that does. Also, Disability Rights Maryland provides some representation. But we're doing that on some government grants, mainly private foundations and private donations. And our best estimate is that we are taking care of, at most, 20% the legal need of people who are living in poverty. So most people are not going to be able to get a lawyer. And they're going to go before the court themselves. Yeah. So, yeah, that's why they don't have lawyers. It's lack of affordability and, by the same token, lack of, any kind of provision of lawyers. Yes, ma'am?
When you mentioned that 95% of landlords are represented, are they oftentimes like repeat, not offenders, but like a repeat in the footprint?
Frequent flyers.
I
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Again, this varies and I'm generalizing, but with tenants, if you're living on the edge, and many of our clients are, like I said, you're gonna make the rent this month and you might not next month. So you're going to be in a cycle of being in court a number of times a year. And certainly the landlords and the landlord agents, they're in the same thing. The advantage the landlord agents have and lawyers is they're in court every day. They're in their home field. Whereas tenants who are coming in are in there, maybe once, maybe never before, and really do not have any idea what's going on. the landlord lawyers have made it very easy for the court to efficiently process cases, by trying to limit the amount of testimony and the issues. Judges will often start the day by saying, we're only going to talk about rent here. We're not going to talk about any housing conditions. So tenants don't even bring it up, even though that's their legal right to. Now, if I'm a lawyer and I'm in court, I will object to that. But judges will do it because otherwise it's going to take, 5 minutes of trial instead of 1 minute of trial? That's going to kill their day. Yes, ma'am?
What about the timeline of what that looks like? So if someone receives an eviction notice, they have X amount of days to vacate the premises.
Yeah.
But I would assume that it then takes longer for that case to be heard if courts are backed up.
Yeah, so let me give you a quick idea of the timeline, and let me point out a major difference here between Maryland and almost every other state in the country. Most states require the landlord to give the tenant what's usually called a notice to quit or a vacate notice or something like that, that says you haven't paid your rent or you've breached your lease and we're going to give you whatever the law requires. It might be 3 days, it might be 5, it might be up to 14 days to fix the problem before the landlord goes to court. When you have a law like that, it encourages the landlord and tenant to settle the issue outside of court and without incurring more costs, the court costs. That's why most states do it. Maryland is one of only a handful of states that prefer to settle all disputes in court. We do not have any pre-eviction notice. So if you owe your rent on May 1st, on May 2nd, the landlord can serve you not with an eviction notice, but with the court papers actually, to say you have been sued in court. Your court hearing is going to be in 5 to 7 days after you're served. So we're talking about maybe a week out, maybe by May 7th now, you're going to have a court date. You're going to have to go to court, and for many people that means taking off work, it means arranging childcare, all kinds of issues, and that explains one reason why there are a lot of defaults too, is people just can't make it to court for one reason or another. Another reason they don't make it to court is because they know the history. Most tenants get evicted, period. It doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what your defense is. You're going to get evicted, and so why waste your time going to court? So what happens then in 7 days, you've got your court hearing. It's possible, again, if you're really savvy or if you've got a lawyer, that might get postponed for another 7 days, another 14 days while we try to get evidence together. But if that doesn't happen, typically within 1 to 3 weeks, there's going to be a judgment made. And if it's against the tenant, the judgment will be the tenant has not paid the rent, the tenant owes $3,000, and then there's a 4-day right to file an appeal, which is almost never done. I think we're like the only ones that ever appeal cases. It's hard. And then the next step is the sheriff, the judge issues an order to the sheriff. It's called a warrant of restitution. And the order to the sheriff is, this person has not paid the rent, they owe this amount of money, they'll put them out. And then the sheriff sends a notice to the tenant of when the actual date of eviction is. This is actually good and important because one thing the tenant does have the right to do in Maryland is to pay off whatever the judgment is and the court costs. And they can beat the eviction that way. They can stop the eviction by paying it off. They don't get any more chances of making a case. But if they just say, okay, I'll pay the money. So what most tenants do is, frankly, instead of showing up at court with what might be a losing case or a difficult case, they just scramble around and try to get the money together. And if they can get the money together, they can pay the sheriff before that final date. The full process takes maybe 6 weeks. And that's with, the court process is actually over within 1 to 3 weeks. The sheriff is backed up enough with evictions that adds a couple of more weeks. But if you just went by the books, you could have a full eviction within 2 weeks.
So what is the reason that Baltimore has this policy and other places don't?